Continuing our discussion of the Constitution. The Constitution is based on some basic principles and will keep in the forefront of the minds of the American citizens as well as the members of the government the basic principles. What was our country founded on? What do we need to remember and look back to when we sort of lose our way? So we went through these in class. Each of these things has a sound connected with it. So popular sovereignty. The applause, what's best for the people, what are the people going to applaud and like and benefit from. Then we have limited government. So in any sports game, when the ref or the ump blows the whistle, that is to prevent something from happening, to maybe give a yellow card or to call a foul on the play in order to limit the power of the federal government, hopefully to protect the players or the people, the members of society. Then we have separation of powers. We have 3 barks, symbolizing the 3 branches of government. Remember, this was part of the Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu's idea of good government. Then we have checks and balances. So with the sound there of a hockey player skating and hitting a goal shot, just like in the game of hockey, you can check an opposing player if they are doing something you don't like or they're getting in your way, but you still must maintain your balance on your skates. So the result of these separation of powers, these 3 branches of governments, is that you can check the role, you can check the actions of the other branches, of the other members of the government, but you still must maintain your balance. Then we have the judicial review. We have a judicial branch to make sure that laws are not injurious, that they are not injuring the citizens. And all of this is part of a system called federalism. So there is our bike horn, and we talked about how federalism is like a bicycle. We mentioned earlier that the Articles of Confederation were like one of those giant big wheel bikes, a little bit out of balance. Now with this system under the Constitution, we have the national government and the state government. Each has their unique role. It functions independently, but it also must cooperate in order to work together to go forward. So this is the system of federalism. Another thing that's included in the Constitution is something called the Electoral College. Rather than allowing pure democracy where every citizen votes and every vote counts and that's how the leaders are chosen, the Founding Fathers were afraid of the tyranny of the mob. And also, they don't really trust commoners. They don't trust the masses of people to make the best decisions. Thomas Jefferson even said that a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. So the purpose of this electoral college is to prevent against this mob rule or bullying people into voting like you. So what happens with the electoral college? Each state has a few electors, people who are chosen, and these people are separate from the members of Congress. However, the numbers in Congress will determine how many electors each state receives. So the number of senators each state has, and in this case it is equal, thanks to the Great Compromise. We take the idea of equality in the legislature from the New Jersey Plan. Each state gets 2 electors. And then the number of representatives that they have, that's the Virginia Plan based on population. That is the number of electors, total electors, that a state has. The citizens go to the polls in November, they vote, and while they are voting for a candidate, they are more so voting for the electors, and whoever gets the most votes, each elector gets to make 2 votes then. The most votes gets president, and the second most votes gets the vice president's role. And we will see in later lessons how this electoral college is so complicated, and how, while it is intended to prevent against mob rule, it does cause some problems of its own. Once the Constitution is written and created to give separate roles to the national governments and the states' governments, it must be ratified. Ratification is the process of accepting or confirming something. And in order to ratify this Constitution, 9 out of the 13 states had to accept it, had to pass it. And the drafters, or the writers of the Constitution, they were not entirely sure that this was going to happen. And so what was planned is, after the Constitution is drafted, in September of 1787, they send it back to the states, and the states will have meetings or conventions in order to decide if each state wants to ratify. And so from here we get these two groups, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. They're going to try and influence the states, influence the citizens, either to ratify and accept the Constitution or to not ratify the Constitution. For the Federalists, they want strong central government, the federal government, to be in control. The men who are writing or supporting the Federalists, we have Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They want a strong national government because they think it will be good to manage war debt, possibly create a central bank, and they want ratification, acceptance of the Constitution. On the other side, the Anti-Federalists, we have Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, and Patrick Henry. And they believe that the local governments, that the states should have more power. Patrick Henry, you can remember this in the Revolution, he said, give me liberty or give me death. So he believes in personal, individual liberties. In order to convince people of their ideas, particularly the Federalists, they start writing articles anonymously, and they publish them in newspapers across the country. And again, we are seeing the impact of the written word in influencing public policy, and how important it was that the majority of American citizens were literate. One thing that the Federalists wrote, and again they're doing it anonymously, but we can guess through their writing styles who wrote each article. The Federalists say that the purpose of the United States Constitution is to limit the power of the federal government, but not the American people. They're saying just because we would have a national government doesn't mean that the people would be any weaker. The Federalists write articles as well. They do not write as many. They're not as well known, but they do write and publish articles. One thing they said was the evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy. The people do not want virtue, but are the dupes of pretended patriots. So the true liberty is going to come from these people protecting themselves, not from being able to vote more, to have more government in power. So this issue of Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. What do they want? Well, the Federalists, they are going to appeal more to people who are city dwellers, who are merchants, who have more cash on hand, and want that cash protected. Anti-Federalists, people who do not want strong government, they're going to be more farmers, things of that sort, people who don't have a lot of cash on hand and prefer to control their own economic situation. In terms of the geography, we're going to see that the Federalists gain support particularly on the coastline where those major cities are centered. The Anti-Federalists are going to be more in rural areas, again, because of farming communities. And also Thomas Jefferson, an Anti-Federalist, he believes in the local governments, in individual rights, in states' rights. What are the Anti-Federalists proposing? They believe that there should be term limits for members of the House and the Senate. They are afraid that if members of Congress have no limits, that it will just become a dictatorship or an oligarchy where a few people are in power over everyone else. Another thing is they're afraid that if there is a centralized national government, that distance will be an issue, that it will be so hard to communicate with this federal government, that this powerful federal government could pass laws that citizens might not hear about for weeks or months at a time. Then, the Anti-Federalists don't like the idea of concurrent taxation, meaning that both the federal government, the national government, has the right to tax, as well as the states have rights to tax. They believe that that is overkill. So their suggestions are either states don't ratify the Constitution, or we need to make sure that there are specific rights, specific freedoms that are spelled out for the people and for the states. Well, eventually, we do get 9 states that ratify. New York is the last state, and when that 9th state ratifies, the Constitution goes into play, even if some of the other states haven't agreed. We only needed 9 out of 13. So we've had at least enough unity to pass this Constitution and to start having an election and make this government happen. Once the Constitution is ratified and we have an election, overwhelmingly, George Washington is elected, unanimously voted in by the electors of the Electoral College. His vice president will be John Adams. He was the president already of the Constitutional Convention, and he will be inaugurated in April of 1789. That inauguration will take place in New York City. We didn't have an official national capital yet. And you can see this image of him taking his oath of office. Quote, "I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Washington adds the words, "So help me God," and every president since then has used this full oath of office, including the words, "So help me God." And we see, again, the impact of the Christian faith, the Judeo-Christian belief system in the founding of this country. Another thing that Washington influences is his pay. Congress suggested a salary of $25,000, and Washington turned it down at first. He didn't need the money, and he believed he was a public servant. It was his duty and his honor to serve the people. But then he ultimately says, no, I will accept pay, because he's afraid that if he turns this down, he would be setting a precedent for future presidents. So he'd be setting a standard or an example for future presidents to not receive pay. And he was afraid that this would only open up the opportunity or make the job of president appealing to people who are already independently wealthy. So again, we want to move away from an oligarchy or from a few wealthy people who are in power. Another thing that Washington influences is the title. Now, we knew that the office would be called the office of the president. Some people suggested that he might be called Your Excellency, Your Highness, Your Most Benign Highness, Your Elected Highness. John Adams had my favorite proposition, suggested calling him, quote, His Highness the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. A very humble man. George Washington says, just call me Mr. President. I am simply a citizen serving other citizens. And so we see how important Washington is, even in the very first months and weeks of this brand new country.